Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and the working title for today's show is Buy Canadian Movement. Is it really working in 2025? My guest is Professor Francois Neville of McMaster University. So, welcome to the Energy Show, Francois.
Hi, Markham. It's great to be here and look forward to discussing this movement with you today.
Well, this is what I can't tell you how many shows I've done since January 20th on the subject where Donald Trump figures in some way. We do a lot of energy show stories, so the you can imagine the tariffs that have been applied to various goods, including energy. But this is interesting because I see in my social media accounts, Canadians are mad. They're really angry. I don't think Americans have a clue how angry we are. And a lot of people are talking about, buying Canadian, not buying American anymore. Frequent topic of discussion. But tariffs, as a rule, are just bad for both parties, right?
Uh, it's an interesting conversation, and I actually have spent lots of time discussing tariffs with my MBA students this past year. I teach a course in managing geopolitical and social risk. And what's interesting about tariffs is that, in a way, they actually work how they're supposed to work, which is to try and create jobs in very specific sectors. But I think you're absolutely correct in that when you look at them on the whole, in terms of how much they actually cost versus what they're actually doing in terms of protecting a specific sector or stimulating job creation, the evidence suggests that no, they're not a productive way to sort of go about economic and trade policy.
Yeah, I mean, there's been all kinds of stories about, or questions raised about do the Americans really want to repatriate T-shirt manufacturing from, Bangladesh and Pakistan? Probably not. In fact, the Chinese have done some rather inventive trolling with videos on that topic. But the question I think that a lot of people are asking is, will Buy Canadian really work?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and the honest answer is we may not ever fully know whether it has worked or not. One thing that I can say is that compared to other either recent boycotts or boycotts that we've seen historically, it does seem to be gaining more traction. It does seem to have sustained as a movement much longer than these other boycotts. And so I think merely based on the fact that we're still seeing evidence of this movement being quite vibrant, and it's been several months now. It's far as it has exceeded sort of the typical lifespan of a boycott. Then I think it would be reasonable to assume that it is going to have some impact in some way. Now, how big of an impact, how long that impact will sustain, like I said, I don't know that we'll ever truly know. But compared to other boycotts, which by and large boycotts are not effective, it does seem to be an example of a boycott that is working to some degree.
Yeah, and I guess it defines what we mean by, or it depends upon what we mean by working, because I think of travel. Travel is down, way down. We're seeing news stories with video of empty custom lines, that sort of thing. And then we see different states like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is putting ads in Canadian media asking Canadians to come back. We love you, Canada, come back. So in that, in a sense, even if it doesn't hit pocketbooks of American companies and investors, publicly it seems to have made an impact.
I think that's a great point, right? And so one of the ways we can think about is it having an impact is does it seem to be triggering some level of corporate responses or responses from governments? And we see that indeed, as you point out, it's triggering some responses from politicians in the US that are heavily reliant on the Canadian marketplace for some of their economy. But also it is, certain Canadian companies have done certain things to respond to this movement, whether big things or small things. I just saw a large sort of Tim Hortons, extended Tim Hortons ad yesterday on the Canadian dream, right? And we see a number of grocery stores that are labeling Canadian products to make it easier on consumers. And so I think it's fair to assume that this is having an impact because we're seeing businesses respond to it in some way. And businesses are not going to respond to something if they don't think that there is a clear strategic opportunity there for them. So it does seem like it is having some impact.
It's funny. Well, that when Molson's dusts off the old Joe Canadian commercial and remakes it, that people are paying attention, and and businesses are trying to wrap themselves in the flag, as you put it. Is it working?
I think there's probably it's reasonable to assume that it is working to some extent. And maybe one of the biggest examples of this is the fact that Loblaws was not a very popular company with many Canadians during
That's
these
right.
past summer months. And now they seem to have kind of at least sort of neutralized that impact by being an easily identifiable Canadian, grocery store market, right? So I think it's difficult. Again, it's difficult to say exactly whether it's having an impact, and I think a lot of this is more driven by what sort of like vibes are we seeing on social media, and how closely connected is that to the dollars and cents of the consequences. But it's just this isn't none of this is going away, right? So I think if we're left to kind of look at it from this, with the simplest explanation, is that this is still going. We're 5 months into this, right? This is not like a fly by night thing. There seem to be pronounced corporate responses, and so I think it's fair to deduce that companies are seeing some benefits of responding to the movement. Otherwise, I don't think we would see sustained action here.
Let's talk about the role of dollars and cents here, because I think you've made the point that for easily substitutable Canadian goods where the penalty isn't too great, then those goods are likely to be substituted. But there are things like strawberries, or a lot of our produce that comes from the U.S. that we haven't got a way to displace those, and very likely we're going to continue to buy from the U.S.
That's absolutely right. And so I think that there are going to be some limits to, the sustainability of this boycott. When we think about overhauling supply chains, right, for a lot of Canadian companies, a lot of Canadian retailers, like there's eventually going to, and even Prime Minister Carney has basically essentially implied that like we've reached the threshold of at which point like dollar for dollar tariffs are effective. Like if we continue, it's going to become counterproductive. And so I think similarly with a lot of businesses, with a lot of these products that are just not really substitutable from a true pragmatic sense, like the cost you could substitute, the cost would just be way too high. It's fair to assume like we're probably going to reach some threshold here at some point. And so that then it becomes more of an individual consumer decision as to, okay, do I really want to buy iceberg lettuce or not altogether? But I think it's reasonable to assume we're not going to see a Canadian or a non-American substitute for every single product in, say, the portfolio of a company's product mix.
Speaking of which, the if businesses decide to chase that sort of buy Canadian sentiment, you argue that it's not costless, that they may have to take thinner margins. So that raised an interesting question. Do they take thinner margins, or do they raise their prices to keep the same margins?
I think a lot of that probably has to do with, to some extent, where are the tariffs being applied? So there's kind of there's the economic dimension of it, which is that, in industries where tariffs are increasing prices, then what we refer to as sort of the price umbrella tends to increase. And so in those industries, retailers, like local retailers, let's say Canadian ones, might have the ability to increase their prices to maintain their margins, but not necessarily, price pushing right up to the price umbrella. So we actually saw that with washing machines in the U.S. during Donald Trump's first term when he placed tariffs on Korean washing machines. the price of imported, specifically Korean washing machines went up, but also the price of American produced washing machines increased because there was an opportunity there for the American manufacturers to either maintain or increase their profit margins. And so I think that there seems to be a certain level of goodwill among the Canadian companies that want to signal their Canadian identity. And so it seems like on average, they are willing to take a little bit of a haircut if it means that that can be offset by increasing market share, by increasing their reputation, by increasing sort of positive sentiment around the company. And so probably they factor that into, sort of increasing their social evaluations. But we're going to run up against some limit where at some point it's reasonable to assume they will have to increase their prices to maintain margin.
I want to wrap up the interview this way, Francois, and that is, it's what happens when the tariffs are reduced. And the reason I ask this question is because I had a trade economist on about a month ago, and he was saying, this kind of is looking like maybe Trump 1.0 again, where he, lots of bluster and threats and so on, and then he gets you to the table, and there's some, renegotiates the Canada, U.S., Mexico agreement with some minor things, just so that he can claim a political victory, and he walks away, and not much has changed. And he said, the trade economist said, well, yes, it's kind of looking like maybe he's doing it again. And I think that now we see him, he's renegotiating. He's already talking to Canada about renegotiating CUSMA. He's got deals with China and, all tentative and, in the works, but here we are. So what happens 3 to 6 months down the road if in fact all of that plays out like it did in Trump 1.0? We have agreements. This all goes away. Does the Buy Canadian movement go away, or are we that angry that it may still have an impact a year, two, three down the road?
I think a lot of that has to do with the talk of the 51st state and the talk of annexation. So if this was a repetition of Trump 1.0 and it was strictly an economic trade war with tariffs, I think many Canadians probably would just sort of take this in stride as, this is kind of, this is not great. Some may want to buy more Canadian, but so I think I think that the talk of the 51st state, the notion around Canadian sovereignty, both economic and culturally, is something that is an anger that I think is going to have a certain level of stickiness with Canadians. I think that many Canadians also now are of the mindset that this type of American, maybe to use an exaggerated imperialism, let's call it, may not stop with Trump. And so I think many Canadians are assuming that this could be the new normal for Canada-US relations moving forward. And from that perspective, I do think there is a certain level of nationalism that has been built into purchase decisions with Canadians now that is going to stick. But I think, it will calm down substantially. But the rhetoric around annexation and 51st state, I think, is what really got many people quite incensed about it. And it's going to, I take some people a long time to forget that.
Yeah, I understand that. And there's some other things Trump did as well, like blaming Canada for fentanyl imports and claiming that illegal immigrants were flooding across our borders, none of which is true. And clearly he did it so that he can invoke emergency powers under his constitution. Well, that's great for him. But if you've got to get to if you have to achieve an objective by, crapping all over your neighbors, not a great strategy. It has consequences. Well, Francois, this has been very interesting. Thank you very much for this.
And sorry, and just to add on to that other point is supply chains with many Canadian retailers are changing. Once those change over and the American inputs into those supply chains have been removed from the supply chain, where is the incentive to go back to them? So there's a consumer side of this. There's also a business strategy side of this. So for instance, the LCBO in Ontario, I've spoken to store managers at the LCBO, and they have essentially said, if this continues for another 3 or 4 months, we'll never have American whiskey in these on these shelves ever again. We'll never have American wine on these shelves again. Why? Because we have enough, whiskey and wine in Western Canada. Once we change these supply lines over, it's too costly to change them back to getting those American products in again. So anyway, that thought just occurred to me as we were chatting
Well,
about that
that's a
last
very
point.
good point because I run across this in other. We do a lot of work on the energy transition here and global supply chains around batteries and solar panels and EVs, that kind of thing. And that point gets made by economists all the time. Once it's hard to get into a supply chain, but once you're in and your customer now trusts you, you're providing a good product, and maybe you might even be a little more expensive than the alternative. But those other qualities count for a lot with your customers, and prying you out of that supply chain once you're in is difficult. And it sounds like the same principle applies here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct.
Great. Well, Francois, thank you very much for that.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a lot of fun talking about it.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.